I'd like to call this a confession rather than a story, given the events that occurred as well as my current situation. My name is Joseph, born and raised in Phoenix. It's arguably one of the largest desert cities in the world, so, from my perspective, the desert is all I thought I knew. I understood the desert's unforgiving heat, how it can get so dry your sweat immediately evaporates before even feeling it drip out of your skin. I understood how barren the land became once you left the city, and how desolate a road can get before reaching your destination. Having experienced what I did, there really is no truer anomaly to life than a desert. If you're not familiar with Arizona, it's a diverse landscape, despite famously being known for its heat. You have cities like Phoenix, which are as stereotypical of an urbanized desert as you can get. Towns like Flagstaff, which sit on mountains that serve as Arizona's gateway to the chilly Colorado Plateau. There is also beautifully rugged land within Native American reservations, such as the Navajo Nation, where off-roading is restricted without a permit. This is where I need to mention that I am Navajo myself, despite having been born outside the res. Even with acknowledging that privilege, however, I've always had a chip on my shoulder when it came to being seen as an outsider by my own cousins, as well as other tribal members who were closer to their roots. If you're a second-generation American who was ostracized by family members in your parents' homeland, despite already facing issues as a minority in America, you'll likely have an idea of what I mean. Basically, you don't feel welcome here, and you don't feel welcome there. This led to an insecurity that I channeled with anger against the status quo of both groups, which is a polite way of saying I've lived like a wild card, constantly doing stupid things, such as purposely getting lost as possible, deep into the wilderness, for days at a time. As I begin to give my story on everything I saw and experienced across the most remote, inhospitable parts of this beautiful state, I want to point out that I am not who I say I am. I can't explain what I mean by this without second-guessing my sanity, so forgive me as I will start from the beginning of my trip to fully understand what's been happening to me. I plan to ride north of Yuma towards the more mountainous parts of desert, slowly making my way south towards the more stereotypically sandy parts hugging the Mexico border before heading north. The first thing I'll say about those mountains is that no elevation increase was going to protect me from the heat. I had enough food, water, and entertainment to keep myself comfortable enough, but the only thing that truly protected me from the sun was time, and so I'd wait until later hours of the day before I'd try my luck at scaling those mountains overlooking the main road. The first night went well to my surprise. I spent a majority of the evening climbing one of the hills that oversaw part of the highway, and after several hours away from the main path, found a nice patch of flat ground to end the night on. The temperature already began plummeting by the time I finished my dinner over the fire, so I wasted no time sealing my tent, triple checking to ensure absolutely no insect made their way through an opening. As a general rule for desert wildlife, you assume everything out there without fur has either spikes or poison, or both. It's easy to clear the area of choyas and residual cacti pieces, as well as plugging up any holes that a mouse or snake could squeeze through. It's far harder to ensure that no small fire ant or scorpion squeeze through a small tear in the fabric throughout the night. Prior to the start of the next day, this had been my only fear when camping. The morning after was spent in a tiny farming settlement where I was able to resupply for the next few days, as well as take a much-needed shower. Same as before, I spent my evening hiking further out into the wilderness, eventually finding a barren valley inside some small mountains. Unlike the night before, this was miles away from any visible highway, and the only lights that flickered through the dark were my own flashlights as well as some restless stars. Normally, setting up camp in a small valley is a disastrous idea, as a quick monsoon would have no trouble creating a flash flood that could swallow you in minutes. My reasoning was that monsoons weren't common this time of year, and not a single cloud touched the sky during the day. Worst case scenario, humans can smell a rainstorm better than a shark can smell blood, so if the sweet scent of creosote hit my nose, I'd know it's time to pack up. After eating my meal for the night, I sat there in the cold as slow music played from my tent. The time went past 11, which was an hour past my normal outdoor curfew. Instead of shutting my eyes and hoping I'd sleep eventually, I'd figure I'd tire myself out by checking out the surrounding hills. You may wonder at this point why I'm not afraid of being in this scenario, all alone in the desert. That's just the kind of confidence that a handgun and pistol caliber carbine will give you. Since the air was still crisp, I didn't see much of the active night wildlife that I'd normally try to avoid. Not a single spider, scorpion, or even bat. I stopped as soon as I made my first turn around a hill and perked my ear up. Not even a single owl, and those things are shamelessly loud. This could have been due to being in an especially barren part of the wilderness, but it could also mean that there was a large predator nearby, such as a mountain lion. I decided to not take any further risks and proceeded to go back the way I came. I found the lights coming from my tent after several minutes of backtracking and felt a wave of relief, stopping to get another listen of my surroundings. Still, nothing. With careful footing, I jogged back to my tent, quickly paying attention to whatever items may have been tampered with from the distance. Everything looked the same, but I went in to grab my camp gun regardless. Feeling the weight of my larger firearm, confidence began returning as I shone a flashlight across my surroundings. As expected, nothing. I quickly grew frustrated as I turned off the light, now realizing how easily I had been spooked into arming myself, and shook off whatever remaining goosebumps I had on me. Zipping open the tent, I threw myself in to stretch and laugh off the scare I gave myself, only to realize there was no music playing from my speaker. I chalked it up to losing signal as I had walked pretty far from camp, so I turned it back on and reconnected my phone as I got ready for bed. I spent the next hour dozing in and out of sleep when I heard the music from my speaker suddenly get cut. Confused, I checked the battery and signal of both devices and saw no issue, so I just reconnected my phone to the speaker and thought nothing of it. I fell asleep quickly this time, but woke up suddenly at around 4 a.m. when I noticed my speaker disconnected once more. Same as before, I checked both devices and saw no issue. For the sake of getting fresh air to clear my mind, I unzipped my tent and froze, as my brain struggled to comprehend what was going on. There were no mountains or hills where my light shined. The same path I walked was now completely gone, covered in obscure darkness littered with beady white circles as though the stars above was flipped with the ground below. I've been stuck in my own nightmares before, so I prepared myself to waking up in a violent jolt, but nothing came of it. After slapping myself a few times and rubbing my eyes, I still saw nothing but darkness beyond the tent that even my powerful flashlight couldn't penetrate. Upon realizing that it could all be real, the next thing I figured was an eerie fog creeping through the desert during the very early hours of the night. But it would still not explain the white beads that glimmered while my light shined past them. They were pearlescent in shape and color, yet it felt ominous, as though they were all staring at me. Curious and awake, I armed myself once more and got out of the tent to see if the white beads were coming from the eyes of hungry and daring coyotes. When I thought I approached the edge of the foggy enclosure, however, the dark followed and the white beads remained in a fixed position from my perspective. It was at this point that I panicked and assumed I might be having a medical issue with my eyesight. The pupilless eyes didn't look like they were outside, hugging the edge of the dark rim. They moved as though they were all inside my retina, moving wherever my head turned like dead pixels on a moving image. I quickly went back inside to make sure, but the eyes were suddenly gone. Poking my head back out, I saw them again in front of me. The only time they ever left my vision was when I faced the tent, in which they'd be behind its fabric. I entered and exited several times until I concluded with even greater fear that my eyes were working just fine, and that those eyes were coming from out there, somehow shifting wherever I turned to look at the same speed I turned my head. Faster, much faster even. The arc length of those white dots were so much longer than that of my head rotating from side to side. Whatever those things were, they were moving at a frighteningly accurate speed to keep up with wherever my head was looking. Because the white dots were following my vision, I wasn't able to see if there were any more behind me. I hastily pulled out a small mirror from my backpack and shined a light behind me to see my blind spot. There were several figures behind me standing still. They were shaped like coyotes, so I quickly pulled out my handgun and turned sharply at what the mirror showed me. The eyes followed my vision once more, and upon meeting the heads of these canid shadows, two of them locked themselves in place and deviated from keeping up with my gaze. As soon as two white dots locked themselves into the head of one of these silhouettes, the figure contorted into a grotesque position and fled with the most unnatural movements an animal could have. I'll do my best to recall the way it ran, but please consider my fear and what I'm forcing myself to remember, as it all happened in a blur. Envision a dog's shadow with its 4 normal legs. Imagine that dog falling to the side, its legs snapping new joints to give the dexterity of human fingers. Then imagine protruding 4 more legs from its spine, which is now parallel to the ground, its tail splitting into 2 legs and 2 more legs coming out of what should be its mouth. Visualize this entire transformation happening in under a second in complete silence, followed by the shadow running away with the haste of a centipede, the quick thumps of its many legs reverberating through the air when not a single sound was heard during its violent change in appearance. When I checked to see the other shadows remaining still, I had connected 2 more white dots to another shadow, and another transformation followed in still silence. This one's running was far more erratic, and its steps were loud and frantic as it seemingly wanted to approach me, but changed direction at the last second before I could fully see what the creature was. The sound of its legs slapping the ground froze me in place. Human beings were not designed to comprehend the sound of a creature larger than an insect with more than 4 legs running around, and it felt as though whatever I saw fully took advantage of that. These things did not approach me, and the other shadows that loomed beside it did not budge an inch. My breathing grew unsteady, and I couldn't comprehend what I had just seen. Despite remaining frozen in place, I instinctually kept my gaze away from the other shadows as best I could, refusing to allow any more of the eyes surrounding my vision from connecting with those shadows. They had to be eyes, hundreds of them, following wherever I looked. I stood there for several minutes more, finding the strength to lift my weapon and aim towards the scattered eyes out in the dark. They were perfectly round and missing the folds that gave most eyes their signature oval shape, instead showing as featureless slur that dotted the suffocating mist of my surroundings. My mind did not know what else to do aside from wait and hope. Hope that I wake up, or hope that it doesn't come for me. Both actions seemed to work as the faintest crack of dawn began pushing the dark overcast away, gradually revealing the shadows of mountains that oversaw the valley. As I began to notice the sky gradually changing color, my suspicions on the fog were confirmed. No such thing was present. The only other possible explanation as to why not even my flashlight could penetrate several meters beyond my vision was that it was all a hallucination, or a very lucid nightmare that I don't remember waking from. In fact, I could also have been drugged, either intentionally or by complete recklessness when getting my food and drink from that farming town. It would explain my poor vision as well as the spider-like movements of the coyotes I saw observing me. It may even explain my speakers going mute, or the blood-curdling sound of the large legs pounding the ground in frantic escape. It could also just be an unimaginable amount of desperation on my end to wish it was all a nightmare I don't remember waking from. But all that mattered was that as soon as the white beads and shadows cleared away from my vision, I immediately packed up my tent and ran from that valley as quickly as I could. I made it back to the main road before 6 in the morning, the sun already wide awake. Hands still trembling, I checked every part of my body to ensure I hadn't suffered any injuries during my night terror. Never in my life had I experienced something like that, but it wouldn't deter me from ending the road trip I had planned for so long. I spent the next few days in much less secluded areas, closer to the main road and a bit closer to people. I'd be lying if I said my third night wasn't full of paranoia, but the next few nights were thankfully uneventful, with the biggest startles coming from bighorn sheep and rattlesnakes. By the end of the first week, I was ready to try my luck venturing deeper into the desert again. I cruised through the stretch of desert between Interstate 8 and the U.S.-Mexico border for my second week. Like the mountains north of Yuma, the terrain was rugged and full of climbable plateaus. The major difference came from there being a far likelier chance of coming across people, be it seasoned hikers or the border patrol mistaking me for a lost migrant. It's happened before, and I always enjoy derailing my discomfort by pointing out the irony when presenting my tribal ID. I set up a fire near an established campground for the first 2 nights, now making sure the speaker was hardwired to my phone, and enjoy the nearby lights coming from tents and RVs several dozen yards away. Having camped away from civilization for 7 days, it was nice to know that other human beings were nearby. I struggled to make friends to the point where I'm sometimes mistaken for a misanthrope, something I made my peace with long ago. That said, I don't harbor any ill will towards other people, only against small talk. That tidbit, combined with the suddenness of the man's voice, was why I kept a hand to my hip when he sat on the log across the fire, asking me where I was from. "Easy there," he stuttered, lifting both hands. "Don't have to waste a bullet on me. I ain't gonna bite you." I glanced around the fire to get a better look at the individual. The voice was gruff and thick, but the man himself was a wispy older gentleman, nervously scratching his cheek as the other hand remained above his shoulder. "You shouldn't be sneaking up on people in the middle of the night. Can't imagine a dumber way to get shot." "Fire must have been blinding you then. I thought you already saw me coming that way." He pointed towards a lit RV in the distance, hidden by the fire smoke. "See, I'm parked over there. Got the wife and kid wanting to call it early, leaving me to drink on my own." I stared at the man's shadow a while longer, breathing a deep sigh of relief as I regained my composure and lifted my drink. Phoenix is where I'm from. The metropolitan area was large enough to be a vague answer for a personal question. "You?" "Hermosillo, 4 hours south. The wife's from Sales east of here, so we're doing some camping around the area." "Your wife's Tonotham." He nodded, easing closer to the fire for warmth. "Thought you were too. Apologies for the ignorance if I'm mistaken." I corrected him as I went to grab another drink. He began speaking of his trips within the Navajo Nation once he knew who I was, detailing the hospitality he and his wife received during his stays there. He continued to talk about his most recent trip through New Mexico as I sat listening in silence. "Your English is very good," I pointed out. "I've lived in the United States for a long time," he exhaled. "Arizona's always been my favorite state, though I'm a little biased since it's not far from my hometown. Been camping up here since the 80s, and something about the desert just keeps me alive." "Any advice you can give for an amateur like me?" You ain't no amateur," the man jokingly wheezed. "You'd have shot this conversation down if you were." "Maybe I'm just stupid," I shrugged. The man continued to chuckle and shook his head, taking another swig of his drink. You believe in supernatural shit?" I stared into the fire as I asked my question, trying to remember my second night as best I could. "Not too much, no." He raised his brow. "Doesn't mean I try to disrespect what I don't know." "You or your wife have any folklore about this part of the country?" "You gotta be more specific." His grin widened. "I can give you 5 different stories of the same creature." My drink was warm and stale by the time I gave it one final look, but I finished it all the same and quickly darted my head across all corners, hoping my vision wouldn't test me once more. "I've been camping for a week further west towards Yuma. Set up camp somewhere inside the mountains north of there, and..." I shook my head in distress, completely reluctant that I actually believed enough in my experience to bring it up as a real event. And it looked like I was trapped in hell for a night. Eyes staring at me, things running around like giant roaches off in the distance. Felt like a dream until I saw the bruises in all the places I pinched myself. "You didn't take nothing strong?" The man chuckled, holding on to his sincerity. "Nothing but a pack of 6. No pills or anything weird." The old man kept to the fire and waited for his mind to conceptualize what he heard. I repeated my story in more detail, explaining the area, its distance from the main road, and the eyes that locked into my vision. "Ain't nothing any creature I know can do," the man replied. "I know your folks don't speak of these things with outsiders, let alone at night, but you ever considered it could have been..." "Skinwalkers," I interrupted, breaking the taboo. "Thought I'd be here if it was one of them." The man sighed, shrugging his shoulders and popping another drink out of the yoke he carried. "Then all we're doing is storytelling. Not that I don't believe you. I've had some weird stuff happening out here myself, but like I said before, 5 different stories of the same creature." That was to say, he's not interested in storytelling. I weakly chuckled at his response, wincing at the thought of him telling his family about my fearful delusion. "One thing's got me on edge, though." His voice sank. You ever hear of vortexes? I nodded. Like in Sedona? Hey, none of that touristy crap. I'm talking open rifts in the air where energy and whatever else can come pouring out of. It ain't studied because not many people experience it, and when they do, there's hardly ever evidence that a rift was ever really there, since they just seem to vanish in minutes. He quickly stopped himself, hesitating to continue his rambling on the subject. All I've been told is they seem to mostly happen in dry places like a desert. I looked at the ground for a moment, wondering if his statement held any weight on what I experienced. That would explain some things, I laughed. I haven't heard of these rifts outside of selling crystals and doing yoga on the Red Rocks. Well, how many people do you know that venture as far out into the desert like you do? I shrugged, continuously nodding my head. You ever saw a rift? Twice, where I knew I was sober. He motioned 2 fingers. One down Sinaloa near a plot of land a cousin was wanting to purchase. The other was bordering Hopi territory north of the Petrified Forest. Anything you remembered seeing? Nothing close to what you saw. The man scratched his beard. No monsters or anything like that. But I felt people watching me. Thinking about it now, all these years later, you could have told me there was 100 empty faces staring while I tended the fire. And it would have explained the feeling I had in both situations. Well, I was going to make the res my next stop. Well, if you're curious, I can point out where I feel I stayed at. But mind you, it was over 30 years ago, and I've no clue the exact latitude. I'd have better luck showing you where in Mexico I saw what Not interested. I laughed, waving my hand. One experience was enough for me. Suit yourself, he shrugged, lifting himself up. Not like any of this is real to begin with, but let me still give you a warning if you stumble across one. Tell me then, I responded, playing along. The man took another long stare at me across the fire, his leathery face now protruding from out his cheeks as a smirk welled over his expression. If these rifts exist, it's not like they have any labeled exits, right? Been thinking about that for decades now. His face looked grim, like that of a lost child stranded in a sea of strangers. While quickly regaining his composure, he kept the same face as he turned around and walked back to his vehicle, his hand still clenching to the yoke of the remaining beer cans. I called it a night several minutes after, pondering where I planned to go for the next few days, but by the time I was ready to make breakfast, the man's vehicle was gone. Remembering the dour look on his face several hours earlier as he shuffled away from my camp, I revved my bike and routed my way towards the highway with a newfound curiosity of this rift, this irregularity in the desert that plagued us both. The final part of my trip stretched around northeast Arizona, and I dedicated my first few days to the touristy spots across the landscape. I've seen several lifetimes worth of canyons, craters, and ghost towns by this point, and I wanted to spend the final stretch of my trip repeating the same process as my first few days, which was complete desolation, away from as many people as possible. Truthfully, I was also looking to test that old man's theory. This took me to Navajo Nation, which, as I mentioned earlier, isn't open for off-terrain riding without a permit. This made the likeliness of finding someone out in the wilderness even less likely than the north of Yuma. The nightly air was frigid, and it was the first time throughout the entire trip that I needed a fire to stay alive for warmth. This made my trips out in deeper wilderness slower, due to carrying more fuel than the usual nights I'd stay there, but it was a necessary move to stand a chance against the elements. Not only that, but there was also a dreary feeling of nights being darker than what I experienced further south, where there's more light pollution coming from the main roads and distant towns. Up here, it was a darkness similar to what I saw in that valley, only widespread and without any debate on it being genuine. My first night was already riddled with occurrences that I couldn't explain, animals screeching out into the distance that I readied my weapons for when their noises grew closer, only for their cries to completely halt. One doe's bleating suddenly stopped mid-sound as though the noise came from a video that was paused. Similar to the vision of floating eyes I experienced, it felt as though whatever caused these animals to reconsider their curiosity was radial, as in a circle of danger surrounded me that told any living creature to stay away. It was not as frightening as it sounds, but I kept my 2 guns near me just in case. In addition to this, I heard distant shrieks of powerful gales roaring across the sky. Yet not even a soft gust made the fire in my campsite move any differently. I had no light strong enough to see debris fly around in the distance, but I heard the violent ripples of air blow away clouds of dust from where I was. I should have been frightened, but for some reason, I felt safe. The wind wasn't attacking me, and curious animals kept their distance as well, including small insects. I couldn't help but consider the distant possibility of being in the eye of a small storm, or that animals detected the smell of my fire, or any other sensory hint that told them to turn the other way. Anything that would keep my mind intact from going to superstition. It was all for nothing as I awoke suddenly on my fourth night, to the sounds of many legs pounding the bare stone beneath them. I ran out of my tent and came to face the wall of round eyes once more. Perfect spheres that encapsulated a featureless gaze moving through the air, locking into the position of wherever I looked, no matter how quickly I turned my head. Dread surged through my body once more, but reminding myself of the old man's words, I kept control of my movements and placed my back to the tent behind me. "What do you want?" I yelled out into the rift. "What do you want?" Nothing. I was terrified to look at what may have been scuttling behind my tent, remembering how the canid shadows contorted their bones to flee with spider-like appendages. Closing my eyes, I held a deep breath and pulled the same mirror out of my tent, this time with my handgun loaded. I pointed the flashlight behind me, and in that same instant, took a glance in the mirror and aimed in whatever direction I saw movement. Within that split second, I noticed the shapes were not of coyotes, but of humans. Without thinking any further, I fired my round and felt the sound wave of the bullet pierce through the inside of my ear in agony. Even in partial deafness from my proximity to where I fired my gun, I heard it all the same. A scream, visceral and foreign, came from where I fired at. No longer caring about my surroundings, I turned around, and as I did, a pair of eyes locked in place where the head of a human-like shadow I fired at was. The being twisted its entire body from the hip, and appendages shot out from its torso and head. It ran erratically across all directions with its innumerable limbs, faster than any animal I've ever seen. The only way I could explain it was like spraying a cockroach with pesticide and watch it jolt around randomly with frightening speed, its legs flailing around several times a second before inevitably succumbing to its demise. Cockroaches don't scream, however, and they don't grow new limbs from its body. More importantly, roaches eventually die. Even after what sounded like a direct hit, the shadow continued to scream and flail across the campsite's perimeter with endless endurance, the fog-bound eyes watching it struggle. I watched in horror as it looked like the shadow was trying to find a way inside whatever sphere of warding surrounded me, and in combination with all my senses being overwhelmed, my body shut down and collapsed, my mind slowly drowning out the noise as the suffocating fog finally closed in. I woke up to a dim, oddly shaped room, barely lit by an incandescent lamp. It held the appearance of a bedroom in an old house, but the room was too long, inconceivably so. It was so long that the opposite edge of the room was pitch black, with no visible light from the lamp next to me treading past several yards away. A table was set to my left, and a small couch to my right. Both were at least 30 feet away. A television, far in the distance, was next to a fridge almost a house's length from where I was. I struggled to grasp the odd familiarity of it all. It looked like a bedroom, but designed in a way that no human being could ever build. There were doors lifted above the ground, appliances that were too large or small, and of course the colossal size of the room. There was nothing chaining me, nothing but the pure fear of wondering where I could possibly be. Only my eyes moved, and near the table was the same old man from the campsite who spoke to me. I felt a small wave of relief before my body tensed up harder than it ever had, my heart reaching for my throat in an effort to choke me out of processing what I saw. It was not the same man. It looked like him, but it had far too many teeth in its smile, as though a machine was instructed to portray a man with a toothy grin, and lacked the human understanding to conceptualize what that looked like. Its neck was too long, and its eyes were white marbles without eye folds, similar to what had been watching me all this time. It was a creature in the shape of the man, or it was the man that had become a creature. My legs still couldn't move, and all thought of wondering where I was cleared away, replaced with thoughts of whether or not this being was what I had shot. It continued to stare at me for several agonizing minutes until it slowly moved away from the light, hovering over the twilight outside the lamp's radius. It walked cautiously while remaining clumsy, much like an intoxicated individual trying to convince themselves they were perfectly normal. All that mattered was that it kept moving away from me, and as it finally stopped, it began making noises no living thing was capable of making. It sounded like bone scraping against bone, molars smashing together, iron being twisted, a heavy table sliding across wood. It kept repeating each noise several times like an animal making sounds to communicate, and it eventually shifted towards a human-like whisper. It kept repeating the hushed, monotonous laughter in irregular patterns. It was a laugh I never heard before, but felt far more natural than the metallic noises it had been making prior. Still frozen in fear, I wondered if it was trying to communicate, its other noises being sounds it more commonly used. What are you? My voice trembled as I felt my throat still suffocating. What is this? It stopped the noise it was making and remained still for a moment.
This is you,
the figure said in a coarse voice. It was similar to the gruff man's voice, but with a lingering metallic raspiness to it, as though it were speaking through a brass pipe.
All of this is you.
With the creature far away from me, my muscles eased ever so slightly to grant me the strength to turn my head. I scoped around the area, and the familiarity took the breath from my lungs. It looked like the first home I was ever in. The house my parents had until we moved to a nicer neighborhood before my 5th birthday. The furniture was vaguely familiar, its dimensions subtly warped and contorted, but eerily nostalgic of my childhood. It was in fact a bastardized, corrupted interpretation of how our living room looked like. This is me, I repeated the creature's words. As in my memories?
Not a memory.
The voice echoed throughout the large room.
This is you.
What does that mean? I started impatiently. Am I alive? Am I in hell? Just then, a loud thumping rumbled across the room. The reverberations were almost painful, striking through my body like a cinder block crashing into armor. This creature, this being, shaped like the old friendly man with a family from several nights back, suddenly turned and tilted its head to be completely perpendicular to its neck, bones snapping like twigs in an instant. It paused for a moment before it began clanking its many teeth together to make a chattering sound. It faced wherever the thumping was and continued tapping its teeth the way birds made noises with their beaks. It kept its gaze away from me during the ordeal, and within seconds, the thumping ceased, and my body no longer felt its vibrations. The creature suddenly snapped its neck back into place, facing me as though nothing had happened.
You're all strings of motion, a catalyst of sentience, connected to the primordial in which all thought ebbs. You currently live the way you were not designed to live. Your world of sin may be abstracted in your design, yet you remain within your being.
The creature's answers were isolating. I wanted to escape, to wake up and hear the voice of a human rather than the imitation that was in this room. But if this were nothing more than a nightmare, the only tool in my grasp was my lucidity. How was I designed to live? I challenged its answer. The creature, the old man from the campsite, did not move.
String tethered to the primordial. String knows not what it connects.
Am I the string in your scenario? The creature's head jolted wildly. Still fearful. I understood it as an agreement. What are you? The room remained silent, its familiarity only adding to the dread wavering in the open space.
An observer.
It finally answered.
Life without death, life without end. Furthest away from the primordial, closest to its form.
What's the primordial? The creature shifted around, its voice growling into a low hum and then rapidly plummeting back to the unnatural sounds of gnashing stone and metal. It continued making sounds, walking across the edges of the room as its cries grew otherworldly. Then it suddenly stopped.
You are unable to comprehend.
The creature's voice returned to something human.
Your senses reject its understanding.
It knew. I dreaded the sounds it emanated from its body. Those unnatural and metallic shrieks no living creature was able to make. But I wasn't sure if what stood before me was even a living creature. It considered itself an observer, and I was too frightened to press further. But the thumping returned before I was able to inquire, and my body swelled in discomfort. The creature chattered once more with its bizarre communication, and the thumping settled.
You intruded on the observation and coiled your string to the primordial.
The creature menacingly pointed out.
I am who determines the outcome, as it was my form that you branded.
What the fuck are you talking about? I panicked. What observation? What did I do? The room shook violently this time, my ribs individually rattling with no end. The creature, now furious, flailed its limbs around, and as before, it grew more appendages to run across the shadows, faster than anything I've seen. It ran across the walls and slammed on whichever wall roared loudest. Its shrieks were harsher than rusted nails grinding through glass, and my body begged it all for it to stop. An agonizing amount of time passed before the walls and creatures suddenly went silent. I had lost control of consciousness throughout the ordeal, but what stood in front of me was the same distorted old man that had given me the slightest amount of solace in the reality I found myself in.
They have agreed, and I have settled.
It whispered.
We will restore your tethering, and we shall continue to observe.
I couldn't understand what it meant. I couldn't understand what it was holding back or what it was communicating with. Were all the eyes that surrounded me outside of this room, outside this elongated interpretation of my earliest memory? I asked what they wanted, but I didn't remember its answer. I asked about the eyes and the silhouettes, but I couldn't remember what spoke to me. I kept talking, my mouth still moving, but I no longer heard the sounds of my words, only the vibrations coming from my throat. I kept trying, wanting to know all about what this all was, if it was truly myself or a nightmare that I spent too much time in. I kept at it, my curiosity beginning to overwhelm my fear, and suddenly I grew tired. My eyes dimmed, and all color from the lamp escaped my vision. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sound of my heart dwindled away to a soft hum. I kept my stare towards the creature for as long as I possibly could before waking up to the sound of animals. A rooster, followed by another. I sprang out from my bedding and startled the birds away. Completely out of breath, I felt my lower back ache as I blinked away the dust, rubbing my palms just below the brow. It was bright and the air was dry, heat sinking through my clothes. The blood rushing to my face quickly escaped when I turned to see where I fell from. A hammock, next to a large tree that gave shade for a nearby coop. I slept on barren, red rock the night before, and now see nothing but grassy chaparral beyond my peripheral. I tried in vain to remember as many details of that room as I could, its exits entirely hidden from my sight. Most disturbing of all is that I recalled napping on this hammock with fond familiarity, as though I've known the surrounding area for years without ever having seen it. And my fears were confirmed the moment I looked down at my arms. The wedding ring. And myself. All of it was familiar. It was me. A man from the kid's memories, but myself all the same. My first name is Victor, and in several days I will be celebrating my 65th birthday in my wife's hometown of Sells. About a week ago, I came across a biker who claimed he liked traveling deep into the desert, but came across a rift, a tear through reality that leads to parts unknown. I don't know if it's some gateway to hell, the afterlife, or even something completely alien, so I never dared to meddle with it the 2 times I've seen it. But now I've seen it a 3rd time, through the eyes of that biker, the Navajo young man whose name I never even got. But Joseph is his name. I know his name, his age, his life. How else would I have been able to write this confession on his behalf? I asked how he was there lingering within me, and he explained it all through the overwhelming white noise of separate thoughts storming within my psyche.
So, the rift.
His voice coursed through my skull.
The eyes. Deserve. They tricked me.
I stared out from the yard of my wife's property, happening to find space to listen closely to what new voices rummaged through my head. The more I concentrated, the clearer his words were. And with each new insight on what changed after my siesta, I began realizing this was a revelation I had to keep hidden from myself.
I saw through the rift and was pulled away. What they called my string is now twisted around yours. My body. Find my body or I'll have nowhere to go.
I understood and agreed, but only in the same way one could agree with a separate voice of reason in their head. I never suffered any condition that involved a split personality, but surely it was something that could be medically understood. I tried to believe that was the case, but I knew it was something entirely different. This new voice was in fact the biker I spoke to, the one who gave me this story to write. I know his location, his address, where he last camped, and everything he could possibly have shouted at me within my consciousness. I don't know how it worked, but there was no other way to explain it. This was a haunting, and no option presented a clear solution to removing his voice and memories from my head aside from his demand. I accepted the voice's request to venture to his campsite, risking another encounter with those who observe. Those who enacted the punishment of coiling this man's string of collective experiences to my own. Fruitless as it may be to challenge that which I can't understand, even with the floating consciousness of one who faced it directly, the surge of interest to see for myself what it truly meant to live in a way that was not designed for people reinvigorated the soul. What better curiosity was there for a dying old man to satiate than to seek those who do not know death?